I want to talk a little bit about what the indicators of trance development are so that we can make our leading statements about the development of trance. So, you've seen some trance here today. Presumably you've seen some trance as the subject of your own experience. You've seen some trance naturalistically in your clients. And let's begin. Signs indicate a trance. Relaxation, indicated by slower breathing. The breathing tends to go lower and more diaphragmatic, usually, although there's exceptions to that. Lower shoulders, smoothing of the facial muscles. Jaw. Yeah, jaw's a real good indication. If you get slackening of the jaw, that's a real good indication. Color change. A lot of people next will flush when they go into trance. Defocused eyes, sometimes flickering of the eyelids. Changes in voice quality, kind of less effort to the voice. More economical statements, smooth movements, economical movements. Oftentimes there's little spontaneous muscle jerks or twitches. Some of you reported that this morning. That's kind of a way of getting rid of tension in packets. There's a relative independence from outside experience. In the more profound states, there is, in fact, lack of startle reflex. All right. What sort of subjective indications are there that the client might report or might manifest? Floating feeling, tingling, or what we call paresthesias, sensations of tingling differences, or the sensations that the body is porous, or heavy light, those kinds of feelings, right? There's also a literalism. In the more profound states, it's more obvious. If you ask a person in a profound trance, "Can you tell me your name?" chances are they will say yes. Let's talk just a little bit about pace lead. If you're going to alter experience, you need to know where experience is. And so if I'm going to say to you that I want you to take a step in another direction, I need to know where you're starting from. So pacing statements are statements which basically feed back what is actually happening, or what is inferred to be happening, such as, let me make a series of pacing statements. You're sitting in the room, listening to me. Perhaps you're experiencing the feeling of the chair, aware of the sound of my voice, and you're taking breaths rhythmically and periodically. Now, for the most part, those are pacing statements. A leading statement would be something that I want to lead you to do. I want to change your consciousness. Let me give an example of 3 pacing statements followed by a leading statement. 3 pacing statements. You're sitting here listening attentively, wanting to learn, and because of that, you'll find that in your dreams tonight, you can integrate these understandings. Pace, 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 lead. Well, lead is what? Suggestion. Okay. An expectation. Now, a good example of this is the so-called yes set. And the yes set, by the way, was not pioneered by Erickson, it was pioneered by salespeople. Okay? Right? I'm selling you an insurance policy now, all right? Now, I take it that you're not really sure if this is the correct time for you to buy this. Is that correct? And is it also correct that you have some doubts about whether you really need it? Is that true? And you're not even sure that you like this presentation. Is that correct? So pace, 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 and perhaps now would be a good time to sign. Lead. Okay, that's the so-called yes set, where you get someone saying yes a bunch of times in a row. It's much more agreeable if you can get them to say yes. All right, so pacing is feeding back what is already happening, and there's sort of an implied causality to this. Let me say it a little bit differently so that I illustrate it better. Let me give 3 pacing statements again with an implied causality and a leading statement. Because you're sitting here in the room listening to me, because you're looking forward to the rest of the day, because you're seated, you can begin to make some connections you hadn't made before. Well, the implication is that one causes the other. Okay? All right, so that's another aspect of pace and lead. What I'm going to ask you to do is get into groups, and you may want to keep sort of getting with different people so you have different kinds of experiences. And it's very simple what I'm going to ask you to do. To make 3 pacing statements and then a leading statement. I'd like the leading statement to be about the development of trance. Example. You're sitting there listening to me, looking forward to what I'm about to say, and perhaps your shoulders could begin to drop. Now, you can pace observable behavior and also inferred behavior. Okay? You can make some assumptions about what people's internal states are and pace those, such as the statement, you're looking forward to what I'm about to say. Hopefully you'll be right. Okay. So not only observable, but what you assume may be happening inside. Are you with me? Okay. Now, here's a fun way of doing this, and let me describe how I'd like you to do it. We'll form groups of, let's try 6 this time, just arbitrarily. We'll start out with a single subject, and what I want you to do is I just want you to go around the room, round robin, one at a time, making pacing statements and leading statements to the one subject. When everybody's had a chance, then I want you to reorient them, and for the sake of what we're going to do, let's make the reorientation rather simple. If their eyes aren't closed at that point, ask if they close their eyes, and then just tell them that you're going to count from 20 to 1. With each count, they're going to feel more alive, more awake, more alert, in a good frame of mind. At the count of 1, eyes open, wide awake, rested, and refreshed. Something like that. One subject to begin with. Everybody gets a chance. You make 3 pacing statements about the subject's experience and inferred experience, and then you make a leading statement. Try and compound these, that is, build on what the person before has said, if at all possible. And if you're stuck at any point in time, you can always talk about what's happening, or what is going to happen. You can never get in trouble suggesting what is inevitable. And you're going to, in a moment, take another deep breath and feel a sense of relaxation. When that person is done, the next person gets a chance to be the subject. And we'll just keep going around for, let's try 15, 20 minutes, see where we are with it. If you want some help, call me over. So far, we've been talking about a fairly simple strategy of pace and lead, where you simply call what you see and feed it back. Now, there's other ways of pacing the behavior, and some of you have begun to allude to them. For example, timing the rhythm to the rhythm of the breathing. You'll notice if you take a deep breath in, the muscles have a tendency to tense. When you let the deep breath go, the muscles have a tendency to relax. So doesn't it make sense then, if you're going to use the word relax, to say it on an exhalation as opposed to an inhalation? Okay? Someone was talking about eye blink. What would happen if you were going to use the word heavy and you used it only when the eyes were blinking? So you began to tie the word heavy to heavy eyelids. Okay? So I want you to begin to practice with what we might refer to as crossover mirroring. That is doing things like that is pacing with other than just words. Pacing with rhythm, tone of voice. For example, as you see a person begin to slump in their chair, why not let your voice go down as they go down? Those kinds of pacing tend to be more outside of consciousness. If you say, and you're sitting there and your head's coming forward, that's pretty much inside of consciousness. But if your voice goes down as their head comes forward, that's kind of outside of consciousness and may be more influential. Or if you say your eyes are growing heavy, that's okay, pretty much inside of consciousness. But if you use the word heavy every time you see their eyes flickering, that's more outside of consciousness and perhaps preferable. You with me? So I want you to begin to pace the rhythm of breathing, the eye blinks, the posture of the body. The other thing you can pace is the report of their experience. Now, we call this fractionation. And let me just digress for a moment. There's 2 different ways to learn how to swim. One is to jump into the swimming pool, and the other one is to put your foot in and step out, and then put your foot in up to your knee, and step out, and then up to your hip, right? Now, I prefer to learn to swim that way. Most people prefer to go into trance that way. So rather than just, thank you, here we are, it might look like this more graphically. That is, we go down a little bit, we come back up, maybe not all the way out, and talk about what the experience was. What was that like for you? Well, I saw that happening in this group over here. I thought it was very instructive. You were saying that I was feeling heavy, and I really wasn't. I was feeling floating. Ah, okay. Well, let's try that again. Now, as I talk to you, and as your eyes continue to blink, you're going to find that you begin to feel more and more of a floating sensation. Perhaps you've had other feelings like this in a swimming pool, what have you. Goes back down. Bring her back up a little bit, not all the way out, and say, now what was that like for you? Well, that was very good. The floating really kind of made me think of the times in my life when I would take these warm, pleasant baths. Nice to know. Thank you. Close your eyes again. Now, as I continue to talk with you, you're reminded of the sensations of a warm, pleasant bath. And what happens is, each time you go down a little bit farther. And that's what we call fractionation. And you get their feedback about what their experience is like. You can't do hypnosis out of a book. You can't, with your subject over here, you can't do hypnosis like this because you'll be losing your experience of the client. So what you may want to add, in addition to this crossover mirroring idea that you want to mirror breathing rates, posture, eye blink, in addition to that, you may want to begin to mirror, to pace the report of their experience. Now, the way to do that would be one person goes, does a little bit, and then bringing them back, instead of bringing them back all the way from 20 to 1, you might say, I'm going to count from 20 to 15. At the count of 15, your eyes open. And I want you to tell me what was happening for you. So they come back part of the way, they tell you what was happening, then the next person takes over, and they go a little bit further. Bring them back part of the way, have them describe the experience, incorporate that, and go a little bit further. I'll give you the option in your group of using that or not. If you don't use that, then what I'm going to ask you to do is to simply do the pace leads, but do them again beginning to mirror or to pace eye blink, posture, breathing rates, etc. For people who have issues of control, this is an especially useful device because it's like, again, putting your toe in, then your ankle, and then your knee, instead of jumping into the swimming pool. So come back and tell me about it. Well, it's good, except I got a little bit scared. Well, tell me about being scared. Well, I got scared because it reminded me of when I had anesthesia. Ah, okay. So we probably shouldn't use terms like numbing or tingling. Okay? Or that near-death experience I had. Okay? So find their associations. Oftentimes people have bad associations to trance, to loss of control. So you have the option if you want to get the feedback and do the fractionation or not. If you don't do the fractionation, then at least try to begin to pace with other than words, that is with rhythm, with pace, with tonality, breathing rates, postures, and eye blinks. I'll be your consultant. Why don't you start? If you think in terms of dissociation as the process or as the cognitive mechanism of hypnosis, and then you begin to look at the language of hypnosis, you begin to hear all kinds of dissociative statements. Remember the statement that I gave you where I asked you, I said I was going to count, you'd find yourself back in the room with your eyes open? There was a number of dissociative statements. We dissociated from neck up, away from neck down. That was one. You remember me saying that? The other dissociation was the dissociation of the body from the person. You can awaken as a person not needing to awaken as a body. That's a dissociative statement. You heard people talking in dissociation. You, for example, refer to the arms instead of my arms. Well, at that point in time, perhaps they weren't, in essence, your arms. They were the arms because they were dissociative. The hands, I think someone else said. The body. You heard this. Okay? So it's a dissociative mechanism. So you look at the language. What are some examples of dissociative statements?
Conscious, unconscious.
Conscious, unconscious is a marvelous dissociation. You know, your conscious mind can listen to me and be very occupied in what I'm saying, while your unconscious mind considers its potential for you. Wonderful dissociative statement. What are some others?
The inner child.
Good. That's a perfect one. Sure. That's a naturalistic one. Yeah. The inner child. Or if we really want to make a dissociative statement, that's a good dissociative statement. You can talk about tolerable pain versus intolerable pain. Needed pain versus unneeded pain. Frightening pain versus okay pain. Future anticipated pain versus past remembered pain. You begin to break it up in little chunks. Dissociative statement is a statement that begins to put a person in pieces. A piece of you doing this, a piece of you doing this. Okay? Conscious mind can do this, unconscious do that. Self one this, self two that. The auditory part of you this, the visual part of you that. The little boy part of you this, the adult that. The afraid part of you this, the masterful part that. Okay? And begin to break person, in essence, into pieces. That is the process of hypnosis. Hypnosis is dissociation. When you're sitting there and you can't move your body, that's dissociation. You're dissociated from your body. When you can't say your name, you're dissociated from the experience of your name. Let me give you a structure for making these dissociative statements. None of this is a cookbook, but this may be a guide for you. Your conscious mind can, what are you doing? Listen to me while, or but, or and, or whatever the conjunction is. Your polarity 2 unconscious mind can consider the potential for you because, and then a motivational statement, because you're here to learn. Okay? Your adult mind can manage your life while your inner child can play, because play is a useful thing for you to learn to do. I'm being permissive when I say it that way. I could say is. I could say your conscious mind is here, therefore your unconscious mind can think creatively. I'm just trying to say it permissively. You can continue to do what you're doing while you can do something different, is the strategy. Okay, it's just about being respectful. You could say it very differently. Your conscious mind will continue to think what it's thinking, while your unconscious mind will think something totally different. You could say it that way as well. It's just more directive as opposed to more permissive. It's a matter of style, and a matter of the person you're working with. When we get into assessing cognitive styles, some people want to be told what to do. Other people don't want to be told what to do. Some people respond to challenges. Some people don't respond to challenges. So that would be a matter of assessment of whether that person would respond to a more permissive, you could, you might, you may, or a you will. What I'm going to ask you to do for about 5 or 7 minutes is just get in the habit of talking this way. So I'll ask you to form groups of, 5, let's say. Turn your chairs around and just go around the circle using this structure and make statements like this. So just form these groups for 5 or 7 minutes and get into the practice of talking this way. Do it now. I want to talk about hypnotic phenomena. What is it that distinguishes hypnosis from, say, simple relaxation or meditation or those kinds of states? There's two things, it seems to me. One is the objective, where the objective in hypnosis is to have an objective, and maybe simplistically stated, the objective in meditation is not to have an objective, except to experience the state itself. But the other thing that makes it different is the ability to produce hypnotic phenomena, which is unique to hypnosis. Maybe there's such a thing as a post-meditative suggestion. I suppose that's possible. Or experience, perhaps analgesias, perhaps anesthesias, dissociations. I'd like to talk a little bit about each of those, what they are, a little bit about how to produce them, and remember the principle that that hypnotic phenomena that the client does best is the one that the intervention should be designed around. You know, if the book says the best way to treat a phobia is through hallucinations, but your client can't do hallucinations, don't worry about it. If your client can do dissociation, then work that into dissociating from the fear, for example. You know what I'm saying? Do what they can do best. Well, dissociation, of course, is one of the phenomena of hypnosis. I should also state, because I don't think I stated so far in the workshop, or maybe I did, that hypnosis is not a therapy. It's a tool as an adjunct to therapy. Erickson in 1962 says, hypnosis is exploratory, investigative, corrective, educative, but not curative, and is best thought of as an adjunctive aid. Well, you have some sense of what dissociation is now. You can dissociate cognition from affect. You can dissociate visual representation system from kinesthetic representation system. You can dissociate one set of memories from another set of memories. You can dissociate identity even. In some of the real charged material I work with abuse survivors, I'll have them notice on a television screen or a movie screen an image of someone who they think they know or have a feeling they know but don't know going through X, Y, and Z. Well, it always will be an image of them, but they won't recognize that it's them. And then the instruction is, as it's okay for you to know who that is, you will know who it is gradually. And then they know that it's them. Well, that's, in a sense, a depersonalization dissociation. Age regression and revivification. This is the process. People use these terms variously. When I say regression, I'm talking about the process where they go back and act age appropriate. to what they're experiencing, as though they're actually there again. I distinguish that from revivification. Some people do it the opposite, but revivification is the experience to take the adult observing ego back and look at the scene, but not be in the scene. When Mitch went back, he sort of knew who I was and sort of didn't know who I was, so it was maybe a cross between the two of them. In the revivification, they would know that they were with me and we were looking at the scene together. In the regression, I might become a friendly stranger, or they'd incorporate me into some person they knew back then in order to make sense of this person being back there that they never met before. It's always useful, by the way, to ask for permission for that. If you say to someone that I'm a friendly stranger, you may go up against programming that says that strangers are dangerous. So you need to be careful about that. What I sometimes say is, this voice will turn into the voice of someone that you know, love, and trust. I'll tell you an interesting experience with that. It wasn't quite a regression, but it was a way for someone to give themselves advice that they wouldn't normally give themselves. This was a person who had herpes, and this was the objective of the therapy, to deal with the herpes. And what was clear to me was that she would get herpes every time she went to visit her boyfriend. She had a long-distance relationship. She's now married to the man. And she would get these herpes. It was an injunction from Mother. Mother twice broke her collarbone when she was growing up, when she came back and announced that she had a boyfriend. So, you know, there was some good reason for not having a boyfriend. And she was a wonderful subject, but no amount of suggesting a way the herpes would work. So what I told her one day was that when she opened her eyes, instead of me sitting in front of her, there would be someone sitting in front of her who was wise in the ways of the world, someone she trusted, and someone whose advice she could listen to. She opened her eyes, and I don't remember the name, but said something like, "Martha." And I said, "Yes." And I said, "Well, so you're getting ready to go visit your boyfriend again, huh?" "Yeah." And I said, "Well, are you going to get those herpes again?" She says, "Yeah, I already started to." She was supposed to leave the next day. "Yeah, I've already started to." I said, "Well, why do you do that?" She said, "I don't know. It just always happens when I go to visit my boyfriend." I said, "Listen, why don't you just stop doing that?" She said, "Really?" I said, "Yeah, you don't need those anymore. You know, it's probably Mom's fault anyway. You don't need those." "Really?" "Yeah, don't do it. Get rid of it." "Okay." It was that simple. The next day, it had already started to go away. And I don't think she, at least in the next 6 or 8 months that I saw her, there was no more outbreak when she went to visit her boyfriend. It was that simple. And all that was packaging. It packaged me into a part she could project a part of her own wisdom onto and listen to. And this was someone she had greater belief and trust in than me. Probably on those issues, at least. Hyperamnesia is basically the same as revivification. That is the capacity to recall events, sensations, and thoughts that have been long ago forgotten. The smell of cologne, for example. And by the way, in doing regression, sometimes if you use the sense of smell, it's an easy way back there. I don't know a lot about brain physiology, but I know that smell is a very primitive sense. If you look at the development of the cranium, if we trace it back from humans, as the visual cortex developed, instead of having that forehead back, the visual cortex began to push our foreheads forward. Well, what was prominent before that was the olfactory sense, was our noses. We used our noses a lot more to navigate in the world, hundreds of thousands of years ago. And it's a very primitive sense. And because of that, it's easy to use that as a lead in doing a regression. If you can get a regression, it doesn't matter to what. If you can get someone smelling the smell of the cut grass when they were a kid and they're back there, then moving around from age to age is a fairly easy thing to do once you've got the regression. One point about doing regression, if you're going to do regressive work, take someone to pleasant places first if they're going to go to places that aren't pleasant. Get them used to the idea that they can go to a comfortable place. If you're going to take them to negative places or uncomfortable places, tell them at any time they want to, they can leave that and go to the positive anchor so they can tolerate it. And again, for any of this, always ask for permission as you go. I'll talk a little bit about ways to produce regression. One of the calendar technique is one where you have them imagine a calendar on the wall or wherever with the present date on it, and then have them tear sheets off moving backwards in time
to go back to a time, and that you either select in advance or you tell them to go back to a time that has some relevance to the present-day difficulty. Usually it's best to let them suggest the place and time. One way that I use fairly extensively is I'll use imagery of walking through the woods on a path, make the imagery very rich so they become very involved with it. And then they come to a clearing, and in the clearing is a house, and it's a very inviting looking house. And I'm usually in the imagery with them. We're walking together so they feel a sense of security. We go to the front door of the house, open it up, and in the house is an improbably long hallway of many doors. The same number of doors as the number of years you've been alive. Each door has a number on it from 0 to your present age. There's a chair in the middle of the hallway. We sit down, and then we start asking questions. We want to know more about if there's something from the past we need to look at that has relationship to problem X or problem Y. In a moment, one of the numbers on one of those doors is going to illuminate. Now, the nice thing about the doorways is you can do it in steps. You can say, are you comfortable now walking toward the door? I'm comfortable walking toward the door. Are you comfortable touching the door handle? No, I'm not comfortable touching the door handle yet. Okay. Could you put your ear to the door? Yeah, I'll put my ear to the door. What do you hear? Well, I hear something or I hear nothing. And you can do it in stages until eventually they can put their hand on the door. And this may take a couple of sessions, especially if it's charged material. Put my hand on the door. Eventually I can open the door. Eventually I can walk inside of the door. And you tell them at any given point they want to, they can simply turn around, close the door, go back in the hallway and feel perfectly safe. And that would be a way of doing it as well. Another way to do it, if you want to investigate a particular set of sensations in the past, you do it by anchoring that set of sensations, holding it constant. Say, for example, let's just say that you had a fear. I would tell you in hypnosis that fear is coming over you now. As I count from 1 to 5, the fear gets worse. It's very extreme now. Now, holding that sensation constant, we're going back in time, and you're going to stop at a time where those sensations fit. And they may go back to the genesis of the fear, or at least an early metaphoric context for the fear. Now, the other thing you can do is you can retrospectively build expectation for change. I don't know if you remember Erickson's case of the dental hygienist with the fear of blood. Only he got cases like this. So strange. How many of you ever had a couple come in where they were both anoretic for 14 years and neither one knew the other one was? Do you remember this case of his? There was a couple that came, this is just off the subject, but a couple that came to see him. They both wet the bed at night. Both of them thought that the other one was simply too polite to say anything, that it was only themselves. The intervention was to have them stand on the bed each night and pee in it before they went to sleep. Only he would get cases like that. I'm sure another one is, that's just amazing. Well, the case of the dental hygienist who was afraid of blood. He hypnotized her, set her off in the corner, said, work it out, basically. I don't remember the words, but that was the effect. And she stayed in a trance for like 20 minutes, came back out and said, well, you didn't do anything. You didn't do anything. You had to do something. And he said, I had to do something. She said, well, you must have done something. I must have done something. And it went on like this. And so he simply cued off of what she said and gave it back as a suggestion, thusly creating a retrospective expectation that something had been done. Well, sure enough, the next day she found she was over the problem. In fact, the only intervention he made was say, work it out. And we don't know if, in fact, she worked it out because of that or if she worked it out because of the retrospective expectation. My hunch, it was the retrospective expectation. I've used similar approaches with people where you simply turn them loose in the trance, say, work it out. They come out and say, well, nothing happened. And I say, well, something must have happened. They say, well, I guess something must have happened. I was in it for 20 minutes. Yes. And I say, well, something must have happened. I don't know when you're going to discover what it is or if you even need to know what it is, but something happened. And they begin to fill in the frame retrospectively and, of course, toward the solution of the problem. Do you know what I'm saying?
Pseudo-orientation in time, usually in the future, where, and I've talked about this in a number of cases, where you orient them to the future and have them work backwards in time.
I use a lot of pseudo-future orientation with children. For example, a bedwetter will be taken into the future and told, it's actually a year after the last time I saw you, things are going very well for you. and you've come back just to give me a follow-up report, and I wonder if we could talk. And then in that generally somnambulistic trance, they'll confabulate a story. Like, I'll say something like, so long since I saw you, I don't even remember what that problem was that you came to see me about. They'll give me a description of the problem, which includes their hooks. Okay, well, it was a problem that I was drinking too many things the night before I went to bed, or it was because, I didn't think clean, I didn't think dry beds, or they'll tell you, what their hooks are. And then you sort of say, well, then you help them create a history by saying, well, what did I do that helped you? Well, you told me to do this, this, and this, Oh, okay. And what did I do that didn't help you? And generally speaking, if anyone else has made an attempt to help solve the problem that didn't work, they'll give you that. Well, you tried those pads that had the electric thing, and those never worked, And then you also ask them how they handled the relapses. Say, well, you didn't have completely dry beds, did you, right away, or did it take a while, or how long did it take to go away? Well, it went away over a while. And after it went away completely, did you have one occasionally, or did you not have one at all? Well, I had one occasionally. Well, how did you handle that? Well, I knew it was just, occasional. It wasn't going to come back, and I wasn't worried about it. And then you just sort of tell them that they'll do it. To produce amnesia, you have to produce some kind of motivation for that. Either there is a motivation that exists, or you need to create a motivation for it. Because if you simply tell someone to forget something, they may or they may not, depending on their motivation. There's a number of ways to induce amnesia. One is to remind people of their naturalistic ability to forget. Name stuck on your tongue, a song you can't recall. One of the most common ones is, this one always gets me. You're watching a television movie, the commercial comes on, and you can't remember the last scene of the movie. You had this experience? What am I watching? You had this experience? Because the commercial distracts you. So if you remind people of their naturalistic abilities to do this, and tell them that they do have the ability to forget, and then apply the motivation for forgetting a particular thing. For example, one of the motivations might be very simple, such as, it takes too much energy to remember. You've got better uses for your energy. Why put out all the energy to have to think about all that? Besides, it's all recorded as mental notes in your unconscious mind. You could refer to them if you needed to, but there's no need to have to think about it right now. Another motivation might be, besides, if it's left to your unconscious mind, it's going to do the most good. You don't need to think about it for it to begin to act on itself. Now, there's some trickier ways to do this. Let me give you a case vignette. It was my mother. So a lot of you have come up and asked, can you work with relatives? And I wanted to quote what I quoted to you. Don't. I broke the rules in this particular case. I asked my first hypnosis teacher if you could do this with relatives. And I have a great deal of respect for what he said to me. He said, well, listen, even Jesus didn't heal in his hometown. So, you have to think about your motivation for working with a family member, because it's awfully hard to be objective with a family member. So anyway, my mother was getting ready to I have her permission to use this, even though she's no longer with us. She said if it would help people, please use it. So, my mother was getting ready to have thoracic surgery, and she was very afraid of this. My mother had kind of a fear for most of her life of suffocating, and anything in her face was, just wasn't okay. And this was a big fear. They're going in here and they're putting tubes in and all that. So, in fact, on the day she was supposed to have the surgery, her blood pressure was so elevated they couldn't do the surgery. And she asked me if I would help her. My mother was the kind of person, if you told her to relax, she would get so worried about whether she was doing it okay that she would get more uptight. So you don't tell a person like that to relax. In fact, you tell them to get more tense. Okay, here's what I did. I made a tape recording for her, which she used on her own. And in the tape recording, I used the following strategies. I did a perfunctory little relaxation thing. Just close your eyes and, forget about your hands and all that. But that was about all it was. Okay, but none of this deeper stuff. With her eyes closed, then I said, and you're very nervous. Pace. And you might even get more nervous. She could believe that. Pace. And as a matter of fact, I think you're going to be terribly nervous for the next few days. Now, the surgery at this point is scheduled for 2 days hence. Okay. So I said, you're going to be nervous for the next several days. Now, the important factor there is that several days would be post-surgery. And that's an important part of this. And what you're going to be nervous about is, as long as she's going to be nervous, I might as well tell her what she's going to be nervous about, is whether my stupid sister's going to remember to bring your mail in when you're in the hospital, and remember to water your plants, and whether my father's going to remember to do this that he said he was going to do for you, and a few things like that. Then, there was another fear she had, which would be kind of counter-irritant to the first one, do you know what I mean? And that was, my mother wore dentures. And her other big fear, perhaps even more than that she would die in the surgery, was that she would be in the recovery room and they wouldn't put her dentures back in and her family would see her that way. And this was a big fear of hers. So then I, as the crowning capper, I said, as it were, do you like that? That was completely unconscious. That just came right out. I said, and you'll especially be nervous about whether they will remember to put your dentures in the surgery, and you'll be thinking about this considerably. Well, so she was distracted away from her fears that she wouldn't come through the surgery, that she would suffocate, thinking about all these other things. She went through the surgery wonderfully. She had no remembering of the day of the surgery itself, or the recovery. Her first remembrance of this was the day after, at which point she said, I guess it's over, huh? And she went through the surgery very, very well. So that's another way to produce amnesia, that is through distraction. Have someone think through something. I remember I was seeing a psychologist once for psychotherapy, and he was going to go have a vasectomy. And the doctor was telling him, he was explaining to him what he was going to do in the procedure, and he said, we're going to cut here, and the man fainted. Which I can understand. That's a very threatening thought. It makes me want to, anyway. So I did the same thing with him, basically the same strategy, except a couple other pieces to it. In addition to thinking through it, his surgery was scheduled for a Friday. On Saturday, he was supposed to do a workshop, and I don't remember correctly, take his wife to dinner, I think. And I told him he would be terribly nervous about the workshop, be terribly nervous about whether he'd remember he was going to take his wife to dinner, or whether she'd like it or not. That was the third step. The first two steps were to tell him stories about, and he was a rotten subject, by the way, so it was just kind of close your eyes and let's make do with what you can do, you know, which was arguably hypnotic. The stories were stories about how he had habituated to scary new things that had to do with cutting. I said, I want you to remember when you had your first haircut. And if you think back to when you had your first haircut, you didn't know what they were going to cut and what they were going to leave, which of course was his unconscious fear, right? And you didn't know if you would bleed, and you didn't know what it meant to have your hair cut, or to have your fingernails clipped, and they came at you with the clipper, and it was a terrifying thing at first, but you learned it was okay. That was one set of stories. The second set of stories was how he habituated fear. I reminded him how he drove a bicycle with training wheels, and how even though after a while the training wheels no longer touched the ground, on the day he had them taken off, he was certain he was going to fall over. Those kinds of stories, and then the stories about thinking through it. He too had amnesia for the procedure. He did not remember going to the doctor's office. Oh, by the way, I also, in this case, called the doctor and said, whatever you do, don't talk about the procedure while you're doing it. It's not with local anesthetic. Don't reference it. Why don't you just ask him questions about his weekend? The doctor said, okay, and he did. And the doctor called me after that saying, what did you do to him? I said, what do you mean? He said, there was minimal blood loss. This guy, I mean, he didn't bleed. It was the weirdest thing. He went through it. I had to use very little anesthesia, and it was a remarkable procedure. And the man to this day, it's been years, does not remember having gone through the procedure. So thinking through is another amnestic strategy. Time distortion, the ability to process a lot of material in a short period of time. When Einstein once was asked to explain relativity, he said it's very simple. He said, if you're saying goodbye to a friend at the train platform, an hour can seem like a minute. If you're holding your hand on a hot stove, a second can seem like an hour. We've all had the experience of time distortion naturalistically. One of the ways to suggest these phenomena is to remind people of when they're already doing it. Standing in line for a movie theater where, minutes could seem like hours, and waiting for your turn in line to something in other various places. Waiting for water to boil. Right? If you put the water on the stove and you go answer the phone, it always boils too quickly. But if you stand there waiting for it to boil, it takes forever. Yet it's the same period of time, of course. Automatic writing. This is a variation of ideomotor technique where, with some practice, you can teach a person how to not only speak automatically and let fingers lift automatically and pendulums move, but also how literally they can write automatically. Now, you're not going to start out writing perfectly formed letters when you try this. You may start by just making marks. One of the easiest ways to start this is to use it like you would use the pendulum. A mark in this direction, say, will mean yes. A mark in this direction will mean no. A mark like this will mean I don't know, or variations on the theme we spoke of. That's an easy way to start automatic writing. Ultimately, clients who are capable of dissociating are able literally to write sentence after sentence. Another way to facilitate that is through distraction. Put the person in a trance, give them a book, have them read the book. As they're reading the book and tell them you're going to test them on it or something, so they're really involved in it, and then let the other hand begin to write its reactions. We used to also, and this helps some people because often, and use a good a roller point pen or a felt tip pen that moves easily across the page with less resistance. We also used to put people's arms in a sling and attach it to the ceiling, so because the muscle intensity is sometimes very, very slight. So if their hand is resting on the page, sometimes what you'll get is a bunch of little marks in a small little space, and they can write an entire book, and it just looks like a blob. So experiment with that kind of thing. Each of these is obtainable in some people by merely suggesting them directly. In a moment, your hand's going to write on its own. You needn't think about it. And the words will simply flow out of your hand like water out of a faucet. Some people that will work, maybe 20-30% of the time. Sometimes you have to retrain them about that. Remind them, for example, when they first learned to write and how they had to make the kind of neurological connections to be able to do that. Or how we get this sort of implied muscle movements in our body when we see something. You see a dancer, for example, and you kind of want to dance along with the dancer. Remind them of that naturalistic strategy, which we all have. Positive and negative hallucinations. These hallucinations can occur in any sensory channel: visual, auditory, kinesthetic, gustatory, olfactory. Positive hallucination is seeing something or experiencing something that isn't there. A negative hallucination is not experiencing something that is there. I suggest they have rather limited clinical use. And there's certainly, Erickson wrote a number of cases in which he uses them, but as a practical matter, I've rarely used these. This case of the bulimic was an exceptional person, an exceptional subject, and I did use hallucination with her. She visualized these scenes of her past and her future in crystal balls. But that's not, you don't have to do that. It was in front of a consultation group, and I have a feeling it was more for show than for actual need. She could have just as easily closed her eyes and done the same thing instead of seeing it floating in front of her face. I don't know that there's any particular value to hallucination, to that kind of hallucination. Now, if we go to pain control for a moment, there can be a value of positive hallucination if you can induce a sensation on top of the discomfort that distracts away from it. One woman came to me with a extremely difficult pain in her sternum, and that she felt as a hot, fiery sensation, and so through hallucination, she experienced it instead as itching, which was far more tolerable for her and far less threatening. So that would be an example of using a kinesthetic hallucination. Anesthesia and analgesia. Suggestibility certainly is a classical feature of people who are hypnotized. Autonomic system control, autonomic nervous system control. The evidence is in now that in trance states we can control otherwise involuntary processes: blood pressure, skin temperature, electrical resistance of the skin, breathing rates, heart rates, blood pressure, I think I said that, etc. Sensory delusions, catalepsy, which has very little practical use. Sometimes in the old days when they were doing surgeries where the arm had to be suspended in the air, they would do that with people. Now it's relatively unreliable and they won't do it, but they used to do that. Well, that's really it in terms of trance phenomena. There's four kind of classes of defense against hypnosis. One of them is sleep.
where a person sort of goes past that trance state into sleep. Now, with any sort of resistance, what you need to do is analyze it and ask yourself what's going on. What are they afraid of? Is it something that we haven't dealt with in the pre-induction talk? Is it some fear or misconception they have? Is there some material they're afraid to get to? Do they not trust me? You know, what's cooking? So I first want to make some sort of hypothesis about it and find out about it. Some people simply associate relaxation with sleep. The only time they ever relax is when they go to sleep, if they're always, charging. So you may want them to sit in an uncomfortable chair or a less comfortable chair. If they're lying down and that's associated with sleep, have them sit up, for example. A lot of people in self-hypnosis will go to sleep, and then they tell me they're doing it in bed at night. Well, don't do it in bed at night. Do it in the uncomfortable chair next to your bed at night. A couple different utilizations for someone to go to sleep. One of them would be that you begin to talk perhaps a little louder, so you begin to hear them orienting. You can hear me now. You don't need to wake up. You could do the same thing, sure. One of the other ways I utilize it, though, is I start talking a little bit louder, and then as I see them stirring a little bit, I'll say, and when I reach the count of 5, you'll be wide awake. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Not necessarily remembering everything that I said. They wake up and say, whoa, I was really out of it. Yeah, you really went deep. Maybe next time not quite as deep, because you don't have to go that deep for what we're doing. It sets up the expectation in retrospect that they were there. They come in the next time with more of an expectation that's going to work. And that'd be another utilization of it.
The idea of fidgeting and moving around and eye-opening and clearing your throat and all of that would be one class of defense. And I want to emphasize that that is reasonable trance behavior for children. Children tend to move around a lot and act as though, at least from an adult perspective, that they're not hypnotized. Do not be fooled. They will do this kind of stuff a lot. And that's reasonable for children, because it's unreasonable to expect a child to sit still for long anyway. Why should it be any different in a trance? So be aware of that. In an adult, it can mean something different. Now, not every time an adult shifts their position does that necessarily mean resistance. A lot of people have difficulty with supporting their neck when they're in a trance, and that will hurt them. Be sure that they have good neck support. If they move their head or whatever, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're coming out of a trance. People can move in a trance. They can talk in a trance. They can have feelings in a trance. So don't be upset by that. If, however, you see a pattern of response such that each time they start to go, they pull themselves back, that's a different story. Now, what do you do with that? Well, a couple different things you can do with that. A, you can utilize it. And as you move, you find yourself becoming even more comfortable. And go ahead and get comfortable in the chair. So you, in essence, give them permission to do what they're already doing. Would be one approach to the so-called fidgeting defense. The other one, though, is perhaps you haven't done a good job of dealing with their fears. And there may be something conscious or even unconscious that's getting in the way. I'll give you an example of this, a clinical example, at least a vignette of it. A woman who came to see me, I don't even remember why she came, but she was to learn self-hypnosis and was afraid to do self-hypnosis and was afraid for me to hypnotize her and would do just what I had just described. She'd start to go into a trance and essentially jerk herself back out of it. She looked to be a very good subject and would start to respond very quickly, but would pull herself back. When asked what was going on, she says, I don't know, I just all of a sudden get this wave of panic all over me when I start to go. And this is a fairly frequent report if you've done clinical work in the area. And so we set up idiomotor signals with her, finger signals, yes and no, and proceeded as follows. Say, would your unconscious mind be willing to give you some idea of what this fear is about? Said yes. Now, you can tie idiomotor into idiosensory by making the following kind of request. Would your unconscious mind be willing to give you an image of what this is about? And so the finger lifted, and what she eventually remembered and brought back into the room was an incident that happened, if I remember correctly, it's in the notes somewhere, but I think she was 7 or 9, something like that. And she was wandering, next to her house was a woods, and there was a stream between her house and the woods, and a little bridge over the stream. She went over the bridge one day, as she usually did, was playing in the woods, but this day decided to go even farther into the woods, and got lost, and was lost until evening. As a matter of fact, the sun went down, and she couldn't find the bridge back over the stream. It's a fairly wide stream, and kept going up and down the stream looking for it and wasn't unable to find it. Finally, her father found her and said something like, and this became an injunction for her, don't ever go across there again or you will never come back.
Well, there's the metaphor. Now, whether that was the cause of her resistance to hypnosis is sort of irrelevant, but it at least was a metaphor for the present situation. So it was just simply a matter of her sort of talking to the little girl inside, saying, well, he said that because he was afraid. It isn't really true. You can re-decide on your own. You know this approach. She re-decided it and became an excellent subject. That would be a way of analyzing the defense, as opposed to, say, utilizing the defense. So if someone were fidgeting in that kind of pattern where they started to go in and jerk themselves back out, then I would take one of those two approaches. To use it, the more you jerk, the more comfortable you feel. It's simply your body ridding itself of excess tension. Isn't it nice to know you can be in control of this and go only as fast as you want to? Approaches like that. Or analyzing the defense, such as the example I just gave you. So that'd be one class of defense. The next one is simulation. This distinction breaks down for me somehow what is real and what is simulated. I'm reminded of Erickson's statement, you can pretend something until you master it. And it almost doesn't matter to me if someone is simulating. How did you learn to be a tennis player? Well, you had to pretend like you were a tennis player. And how are you learning to be hypnotherapist? Well, you're pretending to be hypnotherapist. So I'm not so sure it's a bad strategy. If, however, they give you as-if responses, that is, if the responses aren't integrated, if, you know what I'm saying by that? If they aren't of the whole person and are simply play acting and don't integrate, don't generalize, then it's a problem. So you do, again, the same thing. You can utilize it and just continue to assure them that they're doing the right thing, and after a while they get confused about whether they're simulating or not because they're cueing off of you and you're acting congruently that they're not. And then comes that, what I refer to as subconscious panic, where they test it one day and find that it really is the case that, say, they can't open their eyes or can't say their name or whatever the test is that you choose. That would be one way of proceeding. Or the other way, again, is to confront it. So, that really doesn't look like the kind of responses we're looking for. Maybe they don't understand precisely what you're asking for. Maybe they're trying too hard. And oftentimes that gets in people's way. And, of course, trying is kind of a conscious process. And if you attempt to try too hard, then oftentimes you'll foil an unconscious response. So you might just simply give them education about that. Or, once again, you might find out that they're afraid to let go of control. And then you need to find out, well, why are they afraid to let go of control? And that can be any number of reasons. The last class of defense, if you will, is negativism. Again, the two strategies. One is to confront and analyze, and the other one is to utilize. If a person isn't doing an arm levitation, then you can say, or your hand might begin to feel so heavy that you can't lift it, at which point it might begin to lift. So I don't need to say much more about that, I assume. In terms of hypnotic approaches to pain, there's probably, if we wanted to think about it in broad categories, there's probably two broad different kinds of approach. One would be more of a dissociation approach, and the other one would be more of a modification of experience approach. And I'll talk about those individually. Before I do that, let me go to assessment and talk a bit about assessment before I talk about intervention. It seems to me that what you need to do is you need to assess for the meaning of the pain in a person's life. Is it chronic? Is it transitory? Is it life-threatening? What is its relationship to body image? I would suggest that a pain in the elbow of great severity is probably tolerated easier than a pain of less severity in the genitals. Okay, so the implication for body image, the implication for functioning, the implication for self-image are important pieces of information to assess. So what is the meaning of the pain to them? Then, what is the meaning of the pain in context? What does it have to do with family life and family dynamics, with work, with life plans, with recreation? One wants to assess for secondary gain. Is there some profit in having the pain, if you will?
Is this a way that people modify, for example, is this a way that people modify or moderate other people's expectations of them? And I've seen in the cases that I saw a fair amount of that. Was the pain learned? Was it learned helplessness? The experience of pain occurs in many different contexts, and I want to talk about at least what I think those contexts are. There is the contextual, that is family relationships and interpersonal context in which it occurs. There's the context of behavior, and so-called pain behaviors. It occurs affectively. It occurs cognitively, and I'll come back and review these in a moment. And it occurs in a temporal context. Erickson was one of the first writers to write about the temporal aspects of pain, that pain occurs in past remembered pain context, present experienced pain context, and future anticipated pain context. A lot of pain, for chronic pain, is as a result of anticipating pain in the future and tensing in response to that anticipation, and then increasing the present day experience of pain. So you have to decide, first of all, in which of those contexts are you going to intervene? Are you going to intervene at the level of behavior, cognition? Are you going to intervene interpersonally? I can remember a case of a young man who had chronic pain who'd be hospitalized for it. While in the hospital, he was given all kinds of special privileges. For him, it was a vacation and a time to be special. The intervention there was contextual. We decided that rather than giving him rewards for this, that we would one by one begin to diminish the rewards for this, so that going into the hospital was no longer a fun thing. And we reduced his hospitalizations from a high of at least once per month to about once per year, given this condition he had. And no hypnosis was done. So you have to give yourself, you have to understand that pain occurs in these contexts. I suggest that that you at least need to intervene in the temporal context. That is, you need to, in an intervention, deal not only with the past remembered pain, the present day experience of pain, which will be, and I'll talk about this in a moment, through dissociative techniques or modification of experience techniques, but also the future anticipation of pain. One of Erickson's strategies for recurrent pain, episodic recurrent pain, was twofold. Was to give people amnesia for having had the pain in the past, so they wouldn't refer to it. Thusly, they wouldn't anticipate it in the future. And then when the episodic pain occurred in the present, using time distortion, he would give them the experience of going through it very quickly. And this, as you can see, would intervene in the past, present, and future context. So keep that in mind in working with a pain patient. Many people, simply by going into a trance and relaxing, will alleviate 20% of their pain because the tension is gone. One of the models I sometimes have used with pain patients, and it's not actually correct, but it's metaphorically correct, is you explain how the synapses at nerve cells work. And what you tell them is, at the end of the nerve cell are those ganglia, and they connect together like this. And you say, it's like frayed electrical cord, like lamp cord. You can imagine it making kind of a bad connection, but if you're tense, it makes a better connection. And then more of that pain stimulus goes through. So it stands to reason that if you relax and there's a less good connection, less of the sensation goes through. And I got a lot of mileage out of that one. So about a 20% reduction simply by relaxing. Now, you can also, in a trance, suggest the pain away, in some cases, virtually directly. In a moment, your body becomes numb, there's no sensation in your body at all. It's as though your body were on the other side of the room and you're watching it. However, that may not generalize back to the outside of trance experience, and that's where you have to connect it in or anchor it into the context so that contextual cues trigger those learnings. Find out in what context of their life they experience more and less pain. If they experience more pain in a certain context, then you want to take the learnings from the trance and translate them into that context so they operate as well. Okay, let me go from there and talk about a dissociative approach and then a modification approach to pain. In the assessment, you want to begin to create a climate of dissociation. You might do this by contrasting the sensation of pain with other sensations. How is the pain? And by the way, try not to use words like pain. Use words like sensation. Because when you say pain to somebody, what you're doing automatically is associating them to every painful experience of their life. That word pain is quite an anchor. And it's not just for the present day pain or the future anticipated pain, but it accesses every other painful experience of their life. So you might talk about negative sensations. Or better yet, have them describe the sensation to you without using the word hurt or pain. What is that sensation like? Well, it's a stabbing sensation, or it's a hot sensation, or a chilling sensation, or a tearing sensation, or a sensation of pressure. And have them describe it in detail and then use their model of it. Now, one of the strategies you can use, and I'm getting a bit ahead of myself, for modification of experience is take their metaphor of the pain and work with it. If someone comes in who has chronic headaches and says it's like their head's in a vice, then help them loosen the vice, for example. You see where I'm going with that? A dissociation that your client can accomplish, whether it's the ability to see their body on the other side of the room, or dissociate from an arm, or develop a glove anesthesia, or to have the experience of waking from the neck up, or find a dissociation that your client can do. Build the intervention around that dissociation if you're going to use a dissociative technique. I remember working with a man who was dying from cancer, who was bedridden, and I went to his home to work with him, and the strategy that eventually worked with him was he could imagine being on the other side of the room looking at his body in bed. What we arranged was that once a day, when the pain became unbearable, he would take his head, neck, and shoulders, because it was, I forget what it was, but it was in the trunk of his body, his head, neck, and shoulders onto the deck, which was adjoining his bedroom, and enjoy the view while he left his body in bed. And that was the strategy that worked with him, and it was a natural outcome of his ability to put his body on the other side of the room. That's what worked. Okay, he was capable of doing that. Part of that was because he was an architecture professor and he had some spatial abilities. Then what you can do, you can interview your client on several scales of dissociation where they have to begin to split the pain or the negative sensation into components. For example, you can ask them to make a split between pain and suffering. Maybe rate each of these on a scale of 1 to 10. Of your experience that you came here to work on, how much is pain, how much is suffering? How much is tolerable pain, how much is intolerable pain? Needed or unneeded pain? And remember, the task of the therapy, and you ought to prepare the client for this, the task of the therapy is to manage the experience, not to remove the pain completely. Even if in some rare cases you can remove the pain completely, it's not a good idea. You want to leave, sort of by definition, 5% or 10% of it as a biofeedback device to tell you what's cooking. You need to know, you need to have feedback. And especially, let's say someone is working on a limb pain, that they have an injury, and they want to, be able to walk. You want to tell them still to favor that part of their body, because you can hurt yourself if you don't know that there's pain there. I, a couple years ago, was running in the desert, and I broke my ankle in the middle of this desert, and it was a very severe break. In fact, my ankle was turned in. I had to manually turn it back to be able to get out. Well, I was 2 miles away from any sort of help, and I started to feel myself go into shock. It was like 106 degrees outside, and a little voice came out and says, "You can't go into shock, because if you do, you will die." So for the purposes of walking back that 2 miles, I just pretended in trance that my leg stopped at my knee, and that beneath my knee was some sort of support that was carrying me. And I had no sensation at all in the leg. In an emergency situation like that, that's probably okay, because I knew I had to favor it. But if you forget about that sort of thing, like I eventually had to turn a little bit of it back on because I wasn't favoring it until I was a couple days away from being able to get a cast on it, and so I had to favor it. So you want to keep part of that pain there as biofeedback. Some other scales that you might use,
to divide the pain into dissociative components is divide it between representational systems. How much of the pain is a visual experience? You'd be surprised how much of it is. The way I would cue myself into feeling the hurt in my ankle was I would see it broken. I would see it bent in. And that wasn't a useful image. So I could erase or distract myself from that verbal component of it, and then what was left wasn't as harmful. I mentioned the injections that I used to get as a kid. When I would go in to have blood drawn and all that as an adult, when I was still phobic to needles, that's what would hurt. What would hurt was I'd make an image of the needle going in, tense, and feel terrible when they gave me the injection. So divide it between representational systems. A lot of pain is more of a sort of a concept than an actual sensation. And the concept has us associate then to other painful times in our life, and we compound the experience rather than diminish it. Another way to dissociate is to shuttle between inside and outside. You remember on the first day you had the experience of pinching the back of your hand and having an external fixation point. One simple dissociative strategy is to focus people on the outside when they're having that kind of negative sensation, to tell them that the sensation itself will cue them to become very absorbed in something externally, because the experience of pain is an internal experience. For those of you, again, who've had the experience of runner's high, perhaps you're running in a marathon and you feel like shit, and you start counting the telephone poles, or start listening to the sound of your feet hitting the road, or something like that, and you forget about your body very quickly and the sensations in it. Now, another kind of dissociation is to intellectually examine the pain, to really get into it and look at each little component of it. Is this, how would you describe this component? Is that spasm that you feel, what is that like? Does it start in the upper part of the leg or the lower part of the leg? And is there a visual image that goes with it? And examine it so closely that in essence you forget the gestalt. It's like losing the forest for the trees, so that you then look at each individual little component rather than having this overall experience that you label as pain. Also, by doing this, you move it from feeling to cognition. You can also ask a person to dissociate between the chronic pain itself and the pain that results from that anticipating future pain. Because very few people understand that's what they're doing. You're thinking about the pain coming back. You can also, when I spoke about splitting it between rep systems, once you split it between representational systems, then you can work with it within the representational system. For example, if you imagine that the pain, if you see the pain in part of your body as being red hot, let's just say, why not then just simply watch it turning from red to blue or cool green? And that would be a way of taking that one representational component of it and changing it. And then if you work at a kinesthetic level with it, perhaps the description again is that it's like a vice. Imagine the vice loosening. So work with each representational system differently. We all have naturalistic abilities. At times we've already done this. We've already dissociated negative sensation. I'll give you some examples from my own life, and I'm sure you have some from your own. One of the simplest is how we habituate, to use that word again, feelings. Like when I described this morning, you get a new watch, you're aware of it, and then after a while you don't even feel it's there. Or you put on a tight belt in the morning and you're aware of that, and then as the day goes by you forget that you have it on. That capacity to forget about sensation that is fairly constant, and then we forget it. So you can remind people of that. I think one of the best association stories in my own life was one day I was refinishing a floor in stocking feet using steel wool and a solvent. And I got a nice steel wool sliver, like an inch-long sliver, right up the bottom of my foot. And at first I didn't even believe it was there until my foot just swelled up and started to hurt. And I thought, oh, Lord, I guess I have to go to the emergency room, because I tried to pull it out and the little piece that was sticking out broke off. So I didn't want to go to the emergency room, and I guess part of my grandiosity is at some level I wanted to be a doctor, so I thought, well, I'll try this myself. So I picked my foot up and looked at the bottom of it, and took a penknife and actually an X-Acto knife and put a match under it like I saw him do in the movies, and said, "I'll just cut it out of there." And an interesting thing happened when I put my foot up like that. I heard a voice say, "How do you know that's your foot?" And that was a very interesting question for me. No one had ever asked me that before. And what I realized was I didn't really know it was my foot because I wasn't used to looking at the bottom of my foot generally, and it was so mottled and so swollen that it really didn't look like my foot. Then the voice said, "Well, if it's not your foot, it can't hurt when you touch it." I thought, well, that's an interesting thought. So I touched it and it hurt like hell. And then the voice said, "Pretend like it's somebody else's foot." I thought, well, that's good. So I pretended like it was someone else's foot, and I pretended like I was an emergency room physician, and I just cut that little sucker right out of there with no pain all the way through to the point that it had recovered, because it was as though it were someone else's foot. And that's a dissociative strategy. Okay. Now, sometimes what you need to do to produce a dissociation is a little bit different. You need to simply do the opposite of what you're doing. I mentioned being needle phobic. I want to tell you the story of how I got over my needle phobia. Every time I'd go to have my blood drawn, I would do the same thing. I would anticipate having that negative sensation, and I would tense, and then I would go there, look away, and try not to think of the needle. And it was horrible every single time. So one day, in the midst of this, as she was getting ready to take the blood, I thought, well, that's not going to work, because here I am sweating up a storm. Why don't I just try the opposite? Why don't I just look at it? And I looked at it, and it's my strategy to this day, and it was fascinating to me to watch them doing this. And I became so absorbed in thinking about the procedure that I literally didn't feel it, and I don't anymore. Shots are no problem for me anymore. Just watching it, thinking, that's just a fascinating thing. How does the medicine go in there, or how does the blood come out there, and how do they get that little hole in the needle, and all this kind of stuff. So, and I was so distracted from the experience that I even felt a little bit of loss when she stopped, because I was no longer able to think about it. When I was a kid in the dentist chair, I didn't realize I was using self-hypnosis, but I was. When they did things, and I had a fair amount of dental work done, when they did things to my mouth, I would just check out, and I would imagine that the dentist chair was a rocket seat, and I was taking off, and the sound of the drill would be the sound of the rockets, and I just played with it. Now I know it's self-hypnosis. I didn't at the time, because I hated the needles. So I said, no Novocaine. So all the cavities I had done were done without Novocaine. And I was too stupid to know it should hurt. You know, it's the same kind of thing. Cultural expectations. By the way, in Japan, the incidence of morning sickness with pregnancy is virtually nil. But when Japanese women move to America and become acculturated, the incidence of morning sickness is approximately the same as the rest of the population here. Margaret Mead described a culture in which it was believed that the men gave birth to the spirit of the baby and the women gave birth to the baby's body. And what would happen is the woman got ready to give birth, the men would have the labor pains. But we've all heard anecdotal stories about, the mother who has arthritis, with terrible arthritis, who takes her daughter to the doctors, and the doctor is saying some serious things about the daughter. She is so distracted away to the care of her daughter that she forgets about her own pain. Or we ran a program for a while called Dental Pleasure Program, which was a dental phobia thing. And what we found in doing our research was that some people were so afraid of the dentist, they would have a toothache, be on their way to the dentist, but be so frightened about it, they would forget about their toothache. A contrasting emotion. And then, of course, there's good pain, too, isn't there? The good pain of a massage, or stretching, or of athletics, or of itching, where we have a different connotation to it so it doesn't seem as threatening to us. And you can remind your clients about that. Or how pain stops when we're asleep. Or if you've ever had this experience, say you're in a cold shower and the phone rings and you go to answer the phone and you're dripping and you're cold, but the phone call's so interesting that you forget about it. We've had those experiences. So distraction is another strategy, isn't it, for distracting people out of themselves. Or how we have a natural capacity to forget about past pain. You know, if every woman who had a child remembered the pain of that, there'd only be single child families, wouldn't there? Right?
and I've not been through that obviously, but that's what I'm told, that you really mercifully don't remember that. Let's talk a bit about modification strategies, which actually we've been talking about, some distraction being one. Counter-irritation, that is counter-irritation with a conflicting emotion such as fright or anger. If someone was injured, for example, and I remember one case in particular, a man was injured as a stevedore and had a bad back, and it was through negligence that it occurred. And I told him that when that negative sensation would happen to him, he would be reminded of his anger for how it had occurred, and that was a conflicting emotion, and he was much more into the anger than the negative sensation in his back. I worked with an opera singer once, and the primary strategy with her was a dissociative strategy. She was told that during the procedure, during the birth of her child, she could have the upper part of her body, but she would give the lower part of her body to the delivery team. And if she began to experience any part of the lower part of her body or any negative sensation there, she would burst into song. And she recorded this. She was a wonderful singer, and she sang up a storm. But it worked. That for her was an unconscious habit. That is an unconscious pattern. And so when she was into that, she was in a completely different program and was distracted away from the negative sensation. Again, the effect of context. Where are you having the negative sensation? Under what circumstances? If you're in the middle of a football game as a player and you're injured, or if you're a soldier in the field and you're injured, chances are the things that are distracting you away from that so that it isn't as important to you. If, however, you're off the football field or off the battlefield, sitting at home with nothing to do, then chances are your experience of that negative sensation will be greatly enhanced. So the effect of context. A nurse friend of mine was working on a child oncology ward, and there was a kid there who had leukemia, who was the pincushion, as you can imagine, and just couldn't handle any more of this, and just refused. He just put himself in the ball, said, "You're not going to touch me anymore." And she used a real authoritarian approach to him, a real strong mother tone with him that eventually worked. She said, "Shut up, close your eyes, and tell me about the clouds you see. Do you see faces in them?" And he said, "Yeah." "What kind of faces?" And he went on and described the faces, and that was all she had to do. Thereafter, every time he needed an injection or a transfusion, he would go in and start describing the clouds to the treatment team. I remember river rafting, the first time I ever went river rafting. I fell out of the raft within the first 5 minutes. Got to get it over with, I guess. And I even have the scar still, I got my leg torn up pretty bad by some rocks just underneath the surface. But I didn't know it. The water was cold, and I was so excited about this and so embarrassed, frankly, that I had to jump back in the boat and get back into the front and start paddling again. I was with some friends and family, and I was very embarrassed because they said, "Now don't fall out of the boat." That was the last thing they said. So we went for another half an hour, and I'm just, I wouldn't even turn around to look at them. I was so embarrassed. I eventually looked down at my pant leg, and it was bloody. And I thought, I can't tell them about this, because if I tell them about this, it's going to ruin the day. We'll have to go back. So I better ignore it. I never experienced any sensation from it. One of the strategies is to dissociate a body part and then transfer the dissociation. For example, in achieving a glove anesthesia, you can concentrate on the glove anesthesia, and presumably if it's not in the area where they're experiencing the discomfort, then it's not as charged. There's not as much performance anxiety about it. Let's just say that it's low back sensation, and you work with someone in their hand. Well, if they fail there, it's no big deal. But if you go for the back right away, it is a big deal, and there's a lot more performance anxiety. So you experiment sort of metaphorically, let's say, making that hand numb. And you can use various strategies for doing that. Imagining it changing color, disconnected from you, long ways away, a thick leather glove over it, and a number of strategies for producing the glove anesthesia. Then what you tell them to do is to move that arm, or better yet, let the arm move itself to the place where they want to transfer the sensation. And they just touch it on the place where they want to have it, and you tell them that the hand wakes up only as fast as that part of their body goes to sleep. In dental anesthesia, you do the same thing. Numb the hand out, In fact, we used to do demonstrations like this where we'd get people's tongues numb, and it's pretty hard to talk, or your tongues are numb. So, especially the people who didn't really believe in it, we would, how do you feel? You're fine. So, and that's a fairly simple thing to do. And when in adult life, after I realized what I was doing as a kid was self-hypnosis, then I had to make a method out of it. So then when I had this cap put on without anesthesia, I did the same thing. I would numb my hand before I went to the dentist and just move my finger over the part of my gums and teeth that I wanted to have numb, and I felt no sensation. So transferring a dissociated body part, numbness, to another part of the body. Now, you have to get the person's expectation about the pain. Is it going to go away quickly, slowly? Is it going to go away altogether? And as best you can, you have to meet them in that, because these are closely held beliefs for people who have that problem. Now, another way to demonstrate that a person has control is to hypnotically induce negative sensation in a non-threatening part of their body, and have them have the experience of making it worse and taking it away. So they begin to know, and they begin to break up the mindset that they're out of control with it. We've also done that sort of like a conversion symptom for people who are having emotional pain, where they're not sure they want to carry it between sessions. We've said, for example, in hypnosis, why not let all of that pain reside in the tip of your little finger until the next session. And people go away with throbbing little fingers but feel emotional relief. And you can do it the other way around too. You can convert physical pain into emotional distress if you feel like it. I saw a tape once, this idea of dissociation, to come back to it. This is a bit piecemeal, I know. But I saw a tape once done by an expert hypnotist who happened to call himself an attorney. And it was he was interviewing a woman on the stand who had made a claim for damages for an injured arm. And the interview went something like this. And it was a wonderful pace and lead. He said, "Now, madam, I'm going to ask you some questions. I know you're in some distress right now, but we really want to be sure we understand your distress so that we can award you the proper kind of reward. May I ask you some questions?" Well, you know, he had her eating out of his hand at that point because she felt understood. He said, "Now, I take it that you have some," and he stopped using the word pain and started saying some negative sensation or some discomfort in your arm. Is that correct? Well, in her demand letter, she talked about terribly chronic pain. So already he's modifying it to discomfort. And she's saying yes to that. Of course, the jury's listening as well. "Yes, I have discomfort in my arm." All right. Is the discomfort worse at night? Or no, I think he said it the other way. Is the discomfort better at night or during the day? Well, it's actually a little better during the day. So you have some discomfort in your arm that isn't quite so bad during the day. Yes. Okay. Now, tell me, is the discomfort worse in the upper arm or the lower arm? She thought about it and said, well, really the discomfort's worse in the lower arm. So you have some discomfort that is pretty good during the day and not so bad in your upper arm. Yes? Okay. Now tell me, is it worse in the forearm or in the hand? Well, it's a little worse in the hand. So you have some discomfort that you experience mainly at night in the lower arm, not so bad in the upper arm, not so bad in the forearm, but more in the hand. Is that correct? Yes. Well, I won't bore you with it, but he goes all the way through it till he reduces it to a single finger. So then he concludes by saying, so what we have here is a pain that sometimes is there and sometimes or discomfort that is sometimes there and not sometimes there, mainly at night in your little finger. Is that correct? She said yes. The jury gave her $1. Now, we can argue about whether that was just or not. I personally think it wasn't. But he hypnotized her. He dissociated and modified her experience of the pain. And in fact, when she got off the stand, it was very interesting. She got on the stand looking morbid, got off the stand looking pleased. She actually had some relief. Without knowing it, perhaps, he helped remove that negative sensation. Now, One other principle here is, I said, use the dissociative phenomena they can do best as the dissociation, whether that's a visual kinesthetic dissociation or dissociating a body part or whatever it is, but also use the hypnotic phenomena they do best as the intervention. I'm going to speak a little bit later about what those phenomena can be: hallucination, regression. One strategy for that matter, as long as I said regression had occurred to me, is to regress somebody to before the discomfort, to hold everything constant in terms of the sensation and have them bring that kinesthetic state into the present. I'll give you an example of that with a man who had Parkinson's disease and had terribly painful legs. I just started talking to him about what he enjoyed to do as a kid. And he said that what he enjoyed to do, and you can imagine how long ago this was, he enjoyed to swim in Lake Michigan. Well, you don't swim in Lake Michigan anymore. You rust if you swim in Lake Michigan. But he remembered that. And as he was talking about it, I said, why don't you just close your eyes, Harold, and tell me about swimming in Lake Michigan. And you could sort of see the implied movements in his body. And he got very far into it. And how did the water feel? And what do you remember hearing? And then gradually changing tenses. And what are you hearing? And how does the water feel? And induced through that means a nice trance. And so what he would do then, when he had his episodic pain, he'd close his eyes and he'd go swimming. So that was so regression for him was the best approach to his pain. One can use metaphors about pain in order to make it less charged. If you speak of that sensation as a warning, as a good, that the body's operating well, that it's saying you need to pay attention to something. Like an alarm clock. An alarm clock says, wake up to something, pay attention. And when you've paid attention, you can turn the alarm clock off.